Welcome to Blackwater Media's production of the Nightfall radio show Anthology 3. I'm Dr. William Lester. Thank you for listening. Now sit back, dim the lights, and enjoy this great collection of paranormal, supernatural, and cryptid encounter stories. It's a true pleasure to once again welcome you to these candlelit hallways and torchlit caverns. Our story on this occasion deals with the gods, protector spirits, and magic of the old world. And by old world, I mean Africa, the literal womb of civilization, and in particular, how these powers can be brought to bear in the new world. I therefore offer you up a tale called Permanent Residence. Appropriately titled, I might add, since it's stored here for all eternity on the Nightfall radio show. There's an old slave shack out in the backside of Hollis Field. Before the Civil War, that whole area was Hollis Plantation. Hundreds of acres, mostly cotton, tobacco, and rice. By 1860, Winston Hollis owned a plantation with more than 100 slaves. It's all gone now, of course. The big house, the stables, the outbuildings. Everything except that lone shack, the single remnant of a failed cause and a bygone era. Now, for years and years, the old folks out that way told stories about Mama Sarah. They say that she was a slave on the Hollis plantation, but more than that she was a witch. Now, by witch, I don't mean like what you might see in some movie, or the common image that you're familiar with at Halloween. No, by no means. I mean that Mama Sarah was a seer, a practitioner, and she observed the traditions and beliefs and all of the old ways that her grandmother had brought with her from West Africa. Almost everybody knew it at the time. There were even white people who were a little bit afraid of her. They would never admit it publicly, of course, but the nods and whispers, as they always do, reveal the truth without a single word being spoken. Now, Mama Sarah was always good for cures and potions. She had knowledge of everything growing in the woods: roots, berries, mushrooms, leaves, and things she would not speak of, and could offer remedies for everything from terrible nightmares to a feverish case of swamp fever. But Mama Sarah knew other things too, way beyond the reach of an acidity bag. Like I said, she had the wisdom of things long forgotten by a people who were stripped of their native languages, beliefs, customs, traditions, and history. And she understood and respected the reality and the power of her ancestors, their gods, and the nature of other spirits, both good and evil. Now, Mama Sarah had a daughter named Anna. One night, one of the Hollis sons, a reprobate and well-known good-for-nothing named Charles, cornered her as she attempted to fill a well bucket, pulled her into a nearby outbuilding, and raped her. Upon his departure, he issued the following warning to Anna. One word about this, and your pretty brown skin's going to be food for the alligators and snapping turtles. By the next full moon, Charles Hollis was dead. He had taken on a raging fever, and his body convulsed violently from severe muscle spasms from head to toe. And his back was profusely marked with pinkish red pustules, all from which eventually oozed a foul-smelling dark fluid. Officially, publicly, the doctors concluded that the cause of death was an extremely virulent strain of swamp fever. Privately, however, the suspicion was that Mama Sarah had placed some kind of death hex on Charles Hollis. On the second night following Charles Hollis's burial, two men, James Torn and Eli Sorensen, kicked in the door of Mama Sarah's shack and dragged both her and Anna outside. The men dragged the two women across a field in the direction of the swamp. None of them were ever seen again. Not Mama Sarah, not Anna, nor their assailants. Some people said that the four of them must have accidentally wandered into a bog and drowned in quicksand. Still others imagined that they must have fallen victim to that big, hairy, man-like creature in the swamp that left huge footprints and people were just starting to refer to as the skunk ape. Fanciful tales of adventure, mystery, and intrigue, to be sure. But I can do you one better. The men killed the two women, after, of course, violating them in unspeakable ways, and then sank their bodies into the endless black waters. At the moment of their deaths, Mama Sarah and Anna became one, a powerful guardian spirit, a gigantic magical being that existed to protect and defend the honor and virtue of the ancestral bloodline. And the old gods had imbued this being with all elemental magical strength. Now, like I mentioned at the start of our story, Mama Sarah's shack is the only remaining structure out there. And if you stand close enough to the old barbed wire fence, you can hear the wind whistling through the warped boards and half-rotted roof beams. But if I were you, I'd do it in the daytime. Because if you go out there at night, especially in the deep part of summer, I can just about tell you what to expect. Inside the blackness of the shack, you'll see 3 sets of pale yellow eyes, and they'll most likely be darting all around in a futile attempt at escaping their rickety prison. And then you'll see a towering figure emerge from the thick night air, a 20-foot specter with long midnight black hair, fiery eyes, and the gnashing teeth of a raging lion. It emerges with each rising moon to ensure eternal captivity and torment of 3 souls: Charles Hollis, James Torrand, and Eli Sorensen, permanent residents of Mama Sarah's old shack. And I can assure you that, unlike the slave, their suffering will never end. With a few notable exceptions, this world isn't very kind to the writer. It's an existence of nagging solitude and endless hours stretched out ahead of that which is yet to appear on paper. And the prevailing state of mind is one of normalized rejection and the regularity of self-doubt. Our story this time around illustrates the unfortunate truth that for the writer, the supernatural world can be even more diabolically unkind. Therefore, please accept this little interlude of literary deviltry called Something Strange in the Attic, which should come as no surprise in a place such as the Nightfall radio show. Looking back on everything after a number of years, I don't think that I can properly convey to you the depth of the regret I feel for being dismissive and cavalier, for ignoring the warning signs. You see, there's something strange in the attic. My attic, I mean. And I swear to you that it's nothing short of a nightmare made real. I didn't question why the house was so cheap. I mean, it wasn't a fixer-upper or anything. The wiring and the plumbing were both in good shape. The foundation was solid, and according to the inspector, the roof was in good shape. A couple of fresh coats of paint here and there, and as far as I was concerned, I was good to go. You see, despite a very popular misconception, making a living as a writer is a hell of a struggle. I'd put out 3 books in 4 years, and no less than 10 short stories for various anthologies. But I was driving a car that needed at least 2 of its tires replaced. The brakes were shot too, and believe me when I tell you, there's little charm and glamour in slugging cheap gin and soda at 2 in the morning while slugging away on a laptop keyboard. I often worked until well after sunrise. It was during these working hours, usually just after 3 a.m., that I first took notice of strange sounds. You know how it can be when it's late and the house is quiet? You can sometimes hear things that you would normally never notice during the bustle and activity of daylight hours. Initially, I chalked this all up to the normal clicks and creaks, and even to my own imagination and fatigue. But night after night the sounds returned, usually around the same time, just after 3. I wasn't really sure of the source, but it seemed to me that it was coming from inside the walls. I remember thinking to myself, great, just fucking great, I've got rats. But it wasn't rats. The exterminator that I called out, and really couldn't afford, found no trace of the troublesome rodents. After that, the noises increased. It had graduated to taps and scratching, almost as if something with claws was attempting to maneuver itself through the innards of the house. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out just what the hell was going on. I was becoming increasingly distracted from my work, and this eventually manifested into a level of stress, which was the last goddamn thing I needed. A few days later, I started picking up on a terrible odor. It seemed to be concentrated in the hallway. Now, by terrible, imagine the stench of an open sewer, in a landfill, and rotting meat, and then triple that. It became nearly impossible when the odor hit to keep anything in my stomach. It became more and more difficult to sleep, and nearly impossible to get any work done. Finally, whatever it was that was haunting me, and by the way, I had no problem in acknowledging that it was a haunting, but whatever it was seemed to only make noises directly overhead. Now let me get something straight here and now. I'm not some kind of badass that has no fear of the supernatural or the paranormal or whatever you want to call it. I was scared shitless, but I was also angry at whatever had committed this brazen violation of my life and in my space. I went down the hallway, reached up, grabbed the cord, and pulled down the ladder. Now, as I moved up the rungs, I could hear other sounds, including the sound of air moving around, almost like you would expect the sound of the wind to be outside on a blustery day. I could hear a swirling sound, and small pieces of debris were circling in the air around me. Then, on the far side of the room, I could see a figure, partially obscured in the darkness, and yet still somehow emanating a faint yellow light around itself. And I could hear the growing sound of maniacal laughter moving across the room. I was completely and totally horrified by that point. And then I got a better look at it. It was roughly human-shaped and appeared to be in a squatted or crouched position, almost like a frog or a toad, but with long, bony, sharp-clawed fingers. Its flesh, or what I took to be flesh, was a gruesome mottled amalgamation of pink, gray, and dark green. Its eyes were just empty black pits of nothing, but within them, I could sense an evil older than perhaps even time itself. That was it. I was finished. Fuck it. I literally slid down the ladder, bumping my knee halfway down. As I lifted the door to close it, I could still hear the thing up there taunting me with its fiendish cackle. I got online, found and reserved a U-Haul truck, packed my shit up, picked the truck up when they opened, loaded it, and got the hell out of there. Once I got on the road, I called the realtor, broke the lease, and when he tried to get stupid, I told him he could kiss my ass and sue me. That was 3 months ago. I'm renting a little place in town now, a second-floor flat. I sold a couple of stories last week to a publisher out of Chicago, so I can probably make rent this month and maybe even a stake this weekend. As for the new place, no weird noises, no terrible odors, and no raging demons. And you know why? No goddamn attic. Hello to you all. It's a true pleasure and indeed an honor to have you join me back here in our old stomping grounds, or burial grounds, as is so often the case. Today's offering is quite in keeping with our motif of the monstrous and our normal thematic template of terror. It all unfolds in the Arctic Circle in the year 2032. And for future audiences, that's a decade from where we sit at this point in space and time. And for you, I can only hope that what you're about to hear never comes true. This little flight of whimsy, ladies and gentlemen, is called The Visitor. And I advise that when he comes knocking, that you don't let him, or more correctly, it, in. Because it's only recently escaped the confines of the Nightfall radio show. The capsule was partially buried in the ice when Roger Barrister picked it up on his visoscope. He checked and rechecked the sensor array for malfunctions that might account for the strange readings, and even recalibrated his console. But the readings came through loud and clear. Cylindrical object, 3 meters, composite, high-density steel, boraxium, and an unidentifiable alloy. Spencer Corp, one of the world's leading research firms, had bankrolled the entire project, and they were looking for results, any kind. Biological research stations had been a profitable venture since 1998, particularly for companies in the United States and in Europe. And now it seemed as if all the top dogs from Washington, London, Rome, New York, and Tokyo were scurrying like rabid cave trolls to establish the latest and most technologically equipped research outpost. Now Roger Barrister of the Royal Academy of Sciences was forced into making his first real command decision since his heady days in Central Africa. Either he would wake Doc in York and tell them about what he discovered, or he'd go out alone. He decided on the former and woke them up. The three men got into their thermal outwear, which included exothermal parkas and boots, sub-zero tempered goggles with bino extensions, and gloves with a 1/4 inch of insulation. Each man was wearing standard issue service revolvers, with 60 rounds each and spare cartridges clipped to their belts. As they made their way outside the compound, their palm scope sensors locked in on the object, 1 kilometer to the west. Their readings proved accurate, and they located the capsule with little trouble. Barrister scanned the object for radiation. No sign of radiocontaminants, said Barrister. Scanning for viral and bacterial contaminants, said Dr. Nathan Richards. He ran his metascope across the object and returned it to his pouch. Negative, he said. Okay, let's get this big son of a bitch out of the ice, said Maxwell York. And their Bunsen torches took down 1.5 meters of solid ice in less than 5 minutes. They lowered the capsule down onto the portable anti-gravity platform and headed back to the compound. When they got back, Meteorological Central was radioing in to report an approaching storm. Barrister adjusted the receiver for optimum reception. He then hit the responder switch. M Central, this is S Eagle Outpost. We have received the transmission. Looks like it'll be rough going for a couple of days with the storm coming, said Dr. Richards. We can crack that thing open in the morning, but now, let's get some sleep. And they did sleep soundly that night. Too soundly, I fear. You see, the capsule that the men found should have been left out there in the cold, desolate waste, for it wasn't empty. In fact, the three men had unwittingly provided the occupant of the capsule for the opportunity that it had been waiting for about 50,000 years. Once out of the capsule, the visitor found the area where the men were sleeping and fashioned a huge silk web in the outer corridor. York was the first to be cocooned, then the doctor. Unfortunately, Barrister was somehow roused to consciousness and was audience to his own demise. The first and last images that filled his eyes were flashes of gruesome multiple sets of gray, hairy legs and a pair of gleaming black fangs. 3 days passed. The storm subsided, and the supply chopper was able to land with another 6 months of food, clothing, computer equipment, books, etc. Quartermaster Chen was surprised when no one met him at the landing pier. Outpost teams were usually chomping at the bit for even the slightest contact with the outside world. He punched in his security code and entered the outer chamber of the compound. When he came to the inner door, he paused for an instant. How could anyone do 18 months straight in this mausoleum, he thought to himself. He keyed in his access code, and the inner door slid open. The doctor was standing there to greet him. "Hi, Doc," he said. "Why, Mr. Chen, we're so very glad to see you." "We thought you'd never get here," said the doctor. From directly behind, Chen heard the sound of shuffling feet. He turned and saw Barrister and York smiling at him. And he saw something else. Protruding from the circumference of each of their abdomens were 6 spindly, hairy gray limbs, each tipped with small, shiny, sharp black talons. Then he saw their eyes, now glossed over, grotesquely enlarged, and completely black. He thought about screaming, but it seemed pointless. And in reality it was. He simply stood there looking at them. And when the web came down on him from above, he closed his eyes. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta.
Here's to good friends. Tonight is kind of special. The beer will pour. Must say something more somehow. So tonight, let it be low and brown.
Let it be low and brown.
It's been so long. Hey, I'm glad to see you. Raise your glass. Here's to health and happiness. So tonight, let it be all the best.
When you're with good friends having good times, don't just have a beer. Have a low and brown. Because good friends and good times deserve the taste of a great beer. And there's really only one. Low and brown.
Tonight, let it be low and brown.
Thank you for once again braving the shadows, as well as the haints and hobgoblins which always seem to find a way to torment the peace of a quiet slumber. Tonight's offering is straightforward enough, at least on the surface it seems as such. I return you in time and space to Georgia in the closing decade of the 18th century. Our tale, by the way, is called The Red Man. And what will appear to you initially as a somewhat familiar test of manhood culminates into a realization of abject horror. And why not? You must know by now that such things are part and parcel on the Nightfall radio show. Years ago, some say around 1790 or 91, just after the American Revolution, but before the railroads were built here in Georgia, supplies had to be carried from one town to another on horse-drawn wagons. One afternoon in late January, a number of supply wagons traveling together were caught in a sudden snowstorm. The drivers pushed on through the freezing cold and heavy snow for 3 hours when they came upon an abandoned farm just off the road. "Looks like a fine place to wait out the storm," said a man named Jacob. "I hear tell that the house is haunted," said another driver named Evan. "I'm going to bed down in one of the stalls with the horses." Several other drivers said that they had heard some pretty bad stories about the house too. One man said he'd been told for nearly 20 years. Not a single person who stayed overnight in the house remained alive to see the next day. Most of the men decided that discretion was the better part of valor and opted to sleep in the barn with the animals. "Well," said Jacob, who was somewhat braver than the rest, "I'm not afraid of any ghosts, and I'll be damned if I'll sleep with horses and cowards when there's a real house just up the hill." When he'd finished unhooking his horses, Jacob walked up the hill to the house, which looked old and run down, but in no way frightening. Inside he found a big pot-bellied stove and against the wall a stack of firewood. He built a roaring fire, prepared and ate dinner, and by nightfall had stretched out on a couch that he dragged near the stove. He slept peacefully through the night without being disturbed by anything save an occasional popping from the wood burning inside the stove. About 1/2 hour before sunrise, Jacob woke up and said, "What a bunch of damn fools the others are to have stayed down there with the horses, when they could have stayed in here just as comfortable and warm as me." Right at that moment, he heard a terrible laugh rumbling overhead. When Jacob looked up to the ceiling, what he saw horrified him. There, stretched out under the rafters, was a large man dressed in red. Before Jacob could make a single move, the man in red fell down right on top of him. They tussled with one another, crashing back and forth across the room, knocking over furniture in the room every which way. The men made such a noise that the others down in the barn heard it and dashed up the hill to see what was going on. None of the men dared step foot in the house, so they clustered at the windows, wrenching open the shutters and leaning in. They saw the fight going on, and it was furious. It seemed that both men were equally matched. 1 minute, Jacob would be on top, apparently besting his opponent. The next, the man in red would gain control. One of the other men cried out, "Hold him, Jacob! Hold him!" "You bet your soul I will," yelled Jacob. "I've got him for sure." The next moment, the man in red began whirling Jacob around and hurled him up onto the roof of the house. Then the strange man jumped up after him, so the other man had to stand a distance away just to see what was happening. "Hold him, Jacob! Hold him!" they yelled, one after another. "You just better bet your damn boots I will," said Jacob, panting. "He won't ever get away from me. Never." Now both men were so entangled with each other that the men down below had a hard time telling exactly which arm or leg belonged to which. Then, as the men watched on in horror, Jacob and his red-clad adversary began floating up off the roof. One of the men on the ground cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed, "Hold him, Jacob! Hold him!" "I've got him, and he's got me too," shouted Jacob. Then the man in red carried Jacob straight up into the air until they were both out of sight. And nothing was ever seen of Jacob after that. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all once again into this rather dark and gloomy hall of the horrific. I'm your host. You might call me a master of the monstrous, or perhaps even a connoisseur of the creepy. Our tale deals with an old saying, confession is good for the soul. And if that is indeed true, it must apply even in the most bizarre of circumstances. Our story is called A Werewolf's Confession. And full moon notwithstanding, such a revelation can only be heard on the Nightfall radio show. So, here we are again. The holidays are upon us. All over town, the store windows are decorated in their usual Yuletide regalia. Houses are decorated. Street lamps are adorned with the festive decor of the season. We've even had a dusting of snow, with maybe another 2 or 3 inches yet to come. I think that by the time you hear this, the new year should be upon you. And yet, I sit here at my kitchen table, drinking whiskey in an attempt to silence a nightmare, trying to suppress a demon that rages inside of me. It's not stupid fucking holiday depression. It's not some unadmitted childhood angst. The fact is, I'm a murderer. No, I'm not some psycho killer with mutilated bodies in my basement. No, I'm not a coked out addict who isn't above killing just to get high. It's none of those things. But since I'm sure you're curious, I'll just tell you up front. And I don't give a fuck whether you believe it or not. You see, I'm cursed. I'm forsaken by man and God, whatever God is. But I'm sure that God is real. Because if a dark monstrosity like me exists, then certainly something of light and goodness must also exist. You see, I'm a werewolf. Yes, you heard me. Don't waste time trying to play it back to see if you heard it right. It happened 2 years ago. A hunting trip to Canada with a college friend. We lingered too long and let dark catch us. It came out of a thicket and knocked us senseless. It bit me on the arm. My friend fired at it, and it ran off into the darkness. A month later, under a full moon, I changed. I don't know how many people I've killed, but my blood-soaked clothes are proof enough of my effectiveness as a killer. The deaths are usually passed off as attacks by packs of wild dogs. The police know better, but they can't ever admit the truth. And I can't go on like this. The fear, the remorse, and the pain brought on when I change. It's fucking indescribable. The moon will be full tomorrow night, but it all ends tonight. You see, I have the cure. The only known cure. A silver bullet. All it'll take is this one .45 caliber slug in the nightmare ends. My life, such as it is a small price to pay for the pain, suffering, and death that I've caused. So that's it. Whoever hears this, take it as a lesson. Or better yet, a warning. A warning about the reality of monsters and pure evil. Goodbye. And please, please, pray for my soul. Welcome to all. In case we've never met, I'm your host, your guide through a very bizarre menagerie. Case in point, it has been said by some and held by many that if one wishes hard enough, that wish will come true. Our story, however, teaches us a valuable lesson. Granted wishes sometimes come with a price that you aren't willing to pay. Incidentally, our tale is called Family Heirloom, and I usually keep it safely locked away in the vault of the Nightfall radio show. "10 years ago today, after my father died in a horrible work accident at the coal mines, my grandmother presented to me the family heirloom that had been passed down for many generations. It was after his funeral when she handed it to me and explained the sinister power it had. It was a stone, a very smooth stone with a line of X's that wrapped around it. She told me that the line of X's used to meet around the stone completely. For every wish that is granted to you when you use this stone, an X will fade away, she explained. When she handed it to me, there were only 17 out of the 20 X's that used to be there. But Grandma, we have 17 wishes left. Why don't we wish for Papa to come back? I asked her as I began to tear up. Her face immediately became disturbed. You are never to wish for anything from this stone, especially for your father to come back. With every wish you make from this stone, great horrors come with it, she continued, as her expression became more and more heartbroken. We didn't have any money, my child. We could not afford to feed you or your brother anymore, and soon we were to be kicked out of this home. So we took the stone and wished for health, knowing the horrors that may come of it. And then I knew. The day he died began as normal. His shift was over at 8 p.m., and just before he left the mines he worked in, the ceiling above him collapsed and crushed him, leaving him alive for a few hours as emergency personnel tried to rescue him, suffering for so long as his bones were shattered and his organs were being crushed. He slowly suffocated before they could pull him out of the rubble. A week later, we received a check in the mail for several $100,000. Since then, I'd done research on this stone. I read countless books on rocks, ancient symbols, witches, curses, you name it. Nothing. When I tried to get rid of it, it only came back to appear wherever I went. so I left it locked in a safe under my bed for no one to ever use it. The three of us left in this family became very disconnected since my father's funeral. My mother fell ill and is out of work. So it became up to my brother and I to support each other, my mother, and whatever this house has left. I woke up the next Sunday morning to my brother shutting the door to go to church. He'd become very religious after the mine accident. It was noon when I received a call from the hospital saying my brother was pronounced dead after an awful car accident. My mother and I were in shock as we cried all afternoon. She looked up at me, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. I can't lose him. I can't do this. We had the same idea, and we knew it, to try to bring him back. No, I demanded. We can't do that. It will take me or you away, or worse. I know, she responded. I know. The night was restless as we had plans for the hospital in the morning. But we fell asleep for the very few hours we had left of the night. I woke up to a sudden rumble in the house. My mother missing, and the safe from under my bed unlocked on my desk. And the stone gone. Mother! I shouted and ran downstairs to find her. I caught her standing in the living room with the stone in her hand. I immediately took it from her and counted the 16 X's it had left. What have you done? I need him back. I need them both back, she cried to me with tears streaming down her cheeks. We sat on the couch for what felt like days awaiting our fate, the horror that is about to present itself to us. At midnight, we heard a knock on the door. We jumped to our feet and looked into each other's eyes with terror. With my heart pounding through my chest, I stepped towards the door. I flipped on the porch light and undid the lock. Just as I put my hand on the knob, I looked back at my mother. I pulled the door open, and standing right in front of me, a wheezing, decomposed corpse looking into my eyes, and what looks like my brother's mangled body crawling to my front door as he lets out a blood-curdling scream. This is the horror. Of all the tales that are told, there are perhaps few as thrilling as those that speak of space travel, journeys to distant worlds, alien encounters, and intergalactic wars. It is indeed the stuff of boyhood fantasy and wonder. Our story proves how this is true in more ways than one. Witness therefore a short tale entitled Battle Lines, a cosmic odyssey located in the farthest region of the Nightfall radio show. The Earth ship was under attack. The Kajori vessel was a battlecruiser with a reinforced tridonium hull and protected by Stage 3 shields. The alien vessel released a volley of disruptor blasts, targeting the engines of the United Earth ship Crazy Horse. Realizing that his own shields were holding, Captain Scott Kane ordered the ordnance officer to return fire. The Crazy Horse unleashed a pair of proton missiles. The missiles found their target. Kazal, commander of the Kajori vessel, was undone. The Earth ship had dealt them a deadly blow. The reactor, located at the center of his ship and 3 decks below him, was going hypercritical. Captain Kane looked out the main viewport and watched with great vindication as the Kajori ship exploded. He watched the alien ships scatter apart in countless hunks of debris. With the battle won, Kane went to ship-wide speakers and ordered casualty and damage reports from each department. He wondered if this was the last of Kajori incursion into that sector of Earth territory. It was not possible for him to know what was to come. It was then that 10-year-old Jake Caldwell powered down the game console, closed the cabinet, took a final sip of juice, and climbed into bed. Hey everybody, this is Dr. William Lester, and I want to tell you about a new membership opportunity from Blackwater Media. Now yes, you can sign up for the regular Swamp Hunter Society membership at $4.99 a month and have access to the premium content. But you also have the option of getting the Blackwater Media VIP full year membership. That's right, with a one-time payment of just $49.99, you can have the same access to the same premium content, early releases, at a savings of almost $10 off of a regular membership. So if you enjoy the finest in paranormal and cryptid horror, head on over to blackwatermedia.net and get your Blackwater Media VIP full year membership.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honeybees and snow white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing with me. Perfect harmony, perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a home and keep it company. That's the real thing. I'd like to teach the world to sing with perfect harmony, perfect. And I'd like to buy the world a coat and keep it company. It's the real thing. What the world wants today. It's the real thing. What the world wants today. It's the real thing.
I'd like to offer my sincerest greetings to all who care to venture into this dwelling of darkness. We will journey to the sea islands of Georgia, where the ancient mystic customs of West Africa have evolved and transformed into a uniquely American practice. Frankly, this is a story of brutality, vengeance, and magic. Our tale is called The Gullah Witch, and there is no better place for it than the Nightfall radio show. They called her Mama Lucy, and she lived in an old cabin outside of town, down by Fox Creek. Nobody really knew how old she was, and certainly no one had the nerve to ask. She could be seen each morning and again in the evening just before dark in a rocking chair, and the occasional passerby would wave at her, at which she would respond with little more than a nod. Rumors about the old lady had circulated for as long as a lot of folks could remember. She'd been born into slavery on the old Silas plantation, that much was sure. Her father had been killed by his owner, Henry Silas, and his brother James, when it was learned that he planned for his family to escape to the north, where he would enlist in the Union Army. she never forgot the horror or the grief. In any event, over the years, she showed a knack for concocting all kinds of teas, potions, powders, and even little amulets that many folk believe could fix anything from a head cold to a run of bad luck. But other folks were afraid of Mama Lucy. Some said she was a root worker. Others straight out called her a witch. And there was hardly ever a time when smoke could not be seen billowing from her chimney. One night in the winter, the coldest night of that year, so they say, a terrible scream was heard in the woods. Not an animal, but something not quite human either. Of course, no one ventured out to see what it was. After all, what horror might be waiting beyond the warmth and safety of your door? What evil might be dwelling in those dark, icy woods? Next morning, a grisly scene was discovered in those woods. There were bodies, or rather, body parts strewn about, most stuck to the ground in frozen puddles of blood. They were ripped, torn, slashed, and even partially eaten. All around the area were strange tracks that no one could readily identify. They might have been coyote or even wolf tracks, except that they were much, much too large. The bodies were later identified as members of the Silas family, specifically 2 nephews and 3 grandsons of Henry and James Silas. That same morning, Mama Lucy sat out on her front porch, rocking slowly in the cold, late January air. She looked down at her left hand and saw the red, faded remnants of a pentagram. And for the first time in a long time, a smile of quiet satisfaction appeared on her face. I'd like to invite you all on a most unusual journey. Mind you, we've been on this journey once before. You may in fact recall our previous excursion to first century Palestine. And although the destination is the same point in time and space, the experience, I assure you, is quite different. You see, what has come down to us as a story of betrayal is in fact a terrifying account of sacrifice and release from an ancient curse. Therefore, I offer you now 30 pieces of silver, which, by the way, is the exact price of admission to the Nightfall radio show. Darkness enveloped the city. Beneath the glow of a pale full moon, the streets were alive with activity. There was music, the incessant rambling of street merchants with their squabbling customers, the scent of roasted goat and freshly baked bread, and the powerful aroma of incense imported from all over the region. And of course, Roman soldiers scattered here and there. Not unusual at all for Passover in Jerusalem. Amongst all this, a lone figure maneuvered through the streets, trying to avoid dense gatherings and keeping mostly to the quieter, more dimly lit routes. The cloaked man had 3 destinations. The first was a door to be knocked on to receive the agreed-upon parcel, the payment being information. The second was another door at which the parcel would be delivered. The third was an isolated area outside the city walls, Gethsemane, and there he would wait. It had to end tonight. With all transactions concluded, he made his way out of the city to the prearranged location. A gentle wind danced through the darkness. He could hear the gentle rustling of the olive leaves. He knew that the others were most likely camped nearby, at least some of them anyway. Perhaps Lebbeus, Johann and Andreas, even Matjahu. He wasn't sure. Yagov and Shimon might be anywhere, complaining to whomever they could get to listen. As for the rest, he wasn't sure. He gazed up at the moon. Then he lowered his head, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "Forgive me, Yeshua." And at that moment a form appeared out of the shadows, a man bearing a drawn bow. "It's time, Judas. You held up your end of the bargain. The temple guards aren't far behind. The Nazarene will be taken before Caiaphas. Your money was well spent. 20 Tyrian shekels for me, and 10 Roman denarii melted down to make these arrows." Suddenly Judas felt a twinge of discomfort. Then the discomfort became pain, and the pain descended into agony, until at last the beast, a man in wolf form, emerged. The man fired 2 arrows in quick succession, and the beast screamed in pain and fury, and then fell silent. Only a few minutes later, temple guardsmen found the body of Judas Iscariot with 2 silver arrowheads buried in his chest. They then moved to apprehend the Nazarene. Getting him back into the city without causing a disturbance would be difficult. But Abdel, the captain of the guard, agreed with the high priest. It was better for one man to die than for a whole nation to perish. As always, I'm delighted to have you all here. By now, you've no doubt come to expect nothing less than a frightful excursion into the bizarre, the unexplained, and the downright horrifying. Case in point, exactly what happens to a man when he forgets to be careful about what he wishes for? Well, you're about to find out. Our story is called The Hunter, and such nightmares are quite common on the Nightfall radio show. In the years before the coming of the European explorer Marco Polo, in the Chinese province of Guizhou, in the village of Kaili, there lived a man named Chen. Chen had heard that in a central region of the Kunlun Mountains, just south of the Taklamakan Desert, there lived strange creatures. He took it upon himself to strike out to the region and hunt some of the beasts about which he had heard. His trek was long and arduous, and there were many dangers along the way, which could make up many stories in and of themselves. But when Chen finally reached the area that he'd been seeking, he climbed high up the heavily wooded slopes in search of game. Though he often heard the calls of birds and the sounds of animals in the thickets and underbrush, and though he kept his bow and arrow at the ready, he caught sight of neither pheasant nor deer. That night, Chen became greatly discouraged. He built a simple shelter of bamboo branches, telling himself that the next day would bring the prize that had so far eluded him. Later that same night, as Chen huddled in his cloak, trying to fall asleep, he was startled to hear the sound of heavy footsteps in the clearing outside. Carefully, he peered out of his lean-to. He was shocked to see a tall, thin man, at least 10 feet tall, dressed in white robes. "I have come to ask your help," the stranger said. "I'm going to fight against my enemy tomorrow. Help me, and I will reward you handsomely." Chen was delighted. "I will be glad to help," he said. "What must I do?" Tomorrow, before you prepare your evening meal, go to the stream that flows to the east of here, the tall stranger said. My enemy will be coming from the north, and I will be meeting him from the south. But mind you, I shall be the one in white, and he will be the one in yellow. And though these words puzzled him, Chin promised that he would do exactly as instructed. Next morning, Chin went out in search of game, but returned to his camp empty-handed. Hunger burned in his stomach, and he remembered that it was mealtime. The time had come for him to fulfill his promise to the tall visitor. Now he'd gone only a short distance when he came to the stream that his visitor had spoken of. From the heavy growth on the north bank, he heard a popping and hissing sound. As he listened, Chin thought that he could make out the sound of bushes being uprooted and trees falling. Then he heard a similar sound coming from the south side of the stream. To his horror and utter disbelief, 2 huge snakes, each easily 100 feet long, burst forth from the bush, a yellow one from the north and a white one from the south. The serpents clashed at midstream and flailed at each other with their powerful, monstrous tails. Chin looked on in complete terror and disbelief. As he watched the snakes struggle, he realized that neither snake seemed to have the advantage. Their coiled bodies churned the stream to a muddy froth, while their gargantuan tails lashed the water with the fury of a thunderstorm. Gradually, the yellow serpent seemed to weaken, and Chin was hiding a short distance away, and he realized that the stranger that he'd met the night before must have been the white snake in human form. And so, true to his word, he drew his bow and shot the yellow snake. Then he fired a second and third arrow, both of which hit home, and the snake fell back, mortally wounded. Then the swift current of the stream quickly carried the bloody, lifeless body out of sight. Then the white snake turned and retreated into the thicket on the south bank, and Chin, not knowing what else to do, returned to his camp to wait. When night fell, the stranger returned to Chin to thank him. You may stay here and hunt in these mountains for 1 year. From this day on, you will find all the game you want. But be warned, you must leave this place when the year is over. Never return. If you fail in this, ghastly fortune will befall you. I promise, said the hunter. And with a solemn nod, the tall stranger vanished into the night. Now everything came to pass as promised. The mountain woods and meadows provided the hunter with boundless game, and the stream overran fish into his nets. And he decided that when he returned to his village, he would sell a portion of his bounty. Through this, Chin became the wealthiest man in the province. And he marked the days carefully, so that when the year was up, he left the mountains, vowing to himself, as he had the stranger, never to return. The years passed, and Chin was careless with his riches. When his money ran out, his hunting and fishing barely brought him enough to eat. Most nights, he would sit in his hut, eating a bowl of watery rice with a single piece of fish in it, and gazing into the distance toward the forbidden mountains. In his mind, he would envision the glades where vast herds of deer grazed and the streams that teemed with fish. Then he would remember the dark warning the strange visitor had given, and he turned his head and gave a sigh. Soon Chin had nothing to eat except a few wilted roots and dried bark. His stomach churned with a hunger that raged like the Yangtze River. So great was his hunger that he finally thought to himself, surely enough time has passed, and my hunger is so great that the white snake would not punish me for going to the mountains for just 1 day. So next morning he set out for the mountains, where he quickly found that the hunting was as good as ever. He soon had 30 fat pheasants tied to his shoulder strap. Then at the height of his contentment, he came face to face with a familiar tall figure dressed in white. "Foolish little man," cried the stranger. "Did I not warn you that you must never come here again? Now the sons of Bolath my enemy, have grown and seek to avenge their father's death, and I am powerless to prevent it." With these words, Chin's heart exploded with unbridled terror. He begged the tall stranger to tell him how to escape. "You're too late," said the stranger, and he instantly vanished into the green shadows of the forest. And at that same moment, Chin heard a sound like wind blowing through the trees directly at him. He was gripped like a vice by fear. He flung down his bundle of pheasants and tore down the wooded path. The horrible sounds kept coming closer, and sweat raced across Chin's face as he began to run faster and faster down the trail. Gradually, the sounds started to fade into a gentle breeze until they vanished altogether. Chin stumbled into a clearing, wiping his brow of sweat and sighing with relief. When he looked up, he realized that he was at the very edge of the woods, at the foot of the mountains. But when the shaken hunter was halfway across the open space, 3 men dressed in yellow satin robes, all of them 8 or 9 feet tall, suddenly slipped from the trees and encircled him. Chin watched as their yellow robes slid off, like shed snakeskin. The hunter finally resigned to the horrid insanity which bathed him, and he screamed. He simply screamed. The 3 opened their impossibly huge mouths and kept opening them, even as their hands and feet dissolved into serpentine bodies, which lengthened and coiled. Then in one final instant of terror, satisfaction, fear, and pleasure, the deer and birds and other creatures of the forest were frozen in place, as the unspeakable sound of 3 sets of powerful jaws clamping shut eclipsed the mountains and forest. And then there was only silence. Here we are, together again in this arena of the absurd, this stronghold of the strange. In this instance, I will pull for you a page from a journal penned more than 6 decades past. The journal of a scientist who has, by all our reasoning, a most unscientific experience. The story is called The Living Fossil, and being in a state of prehistoric panic is quite normal for the Nightfall radio show. The Journal of Dr. Matthew Kane, Professor of Biological Sciences, Howard University, 10th of June, 1950, Borneo. A truly remarkable event marked the day. Firstly, our 3-day trek had concluded as we reached a desired research area near the banks of the Capuus River. The region was alive, literally, with a rich spectrum of flora and fauna that rivaled any in the world. Nearly 15,000 species of flowering plants alone, 3,000 species of trees, and hundreds of species of resident mammals and birds. We were in the process, my assistants and I, of cataloging, recording, and photographing, and even taking a few botanical samples when our ears captured the sound of movement, perhaps 30 yards distant and closer to the riverbank. From our vantage point, we could see tall stalks of grass and reeds being thrashed and shaken by something obscured by the greenery. but it was clearly something large. And then we heard more. The growl and eventual roar of an animal. My initial thought was that it could be a clouded leopard, but as the volume and ferocity escalated, I abandoned that theory. And then the thing itself cleared the thicket. The creature that we beheld was impossible. And by that I mean that it was there. We saw it. We heard it. But it could not be there. Though outside of my field, I had read and developed some familiarity with paleontology. And it was that familiarity that told me that this beast was a dimetrodon, a fierce predator that by all rights should have vanished from the world some 40 million years before the dinosaurs. Being naturalists, we understood the dilemma. The reptile would catch our scent immediately, if it had not already. Then we each, I mean the three of us, almost simultaneously sought the wooden handles of the revolvers on our belts. And at that moment, this beast out of Earth's primordial past, this living fossil, being at least 15 feet in length, turned its head, looking directly at us. One of my assistants, a man named Thomas, fired a shot, perhaps two, in the direction of the animal, and I have no idea whether or not the creature was struck, for in those brief moments our gear was gathered and we ran. We ran as though time, space, sky, and earth were nothing. When we reached the Galamba Road in our Jeep, we flung everything in and made off at a fearsome pace. And I am sorry to report that our shock at seeing such a thing diminished our presence of mind, and so there is no photograph to corroborate this account. That in essence is the story. It is now 1963. We each agreed back then to never make a, official report of what happened that day. All that remains is a page and a half in my journal, and the indelible memory of an encounter with a creature lost in time.
You know, a girl's life could sure be a lot simpler if Chevrolet didn't make such fabulous sports cars. I love this new Chevelle SS 396. Nikki says it's Chevy's tough one. All I know is when we move out, the other cars move over. Or take Chevy's Corvette. It won't hold more than Ross and myself. But then is that really bad? I mean, who else do the two of us really need? And besides, the Corvette's not the kind of sports car you usually see around. Unless you're awfully quick. And this is the new Monte Carlo SS. Makes me feel so elegant when I ride in it. Yes, a girl's life can really get complicated when you love to run around in every sports car Chevrolet makes. And you can lose a lot of sleep, too.
It's always a pleasure to welcome a few brave souls in out of the cold. You may find, however, that the distinct chill in the foyer will offer you little comfort. It has been claimed by the less informed that Charles Darwin concluded that man descended from the apes, but that in fact was not his theory. He postulated that which is still prevailing understanding of biologists and anthropologists today, that man and ape, at some point in time, shared an evolutionary link and then went their separate ways. Our story is called The Ancestor, and when you hear it, you'll wish that that link was still missing. Just some typical Stone Age terror, which is strangely common on the Nightfall radio show. Journal of Dr. Matthew Kane, Professor of Biological Sciences, Howard University. 2nd of September, 1958, Washington, D.C. I saw the crate, or rather what was left of it. Among the splintered pieces of wood, I discerned some of the printing which confirmed a point of origin. Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania, which to translate from the Swahili is United Republic of Tanzania, along with the motto Uhuru na Umoja, which is to say freedom and unity. But the thing was gone, and that meant the coming horror was all but inevitable. I had been against the whole thing from the beginning, even amongst all of the excitement of the discovery. One of man's distant ancestors, alive today. Yes, there'd been legends for more than 100 years about man-like ape creatures existing in the vast, dense forest of northeast Tanzania, near Mount Kilimanjaro. They thought that the tranquilizer darts would keep it sedated long enough for the ship to cross the Atlantic and then move to a secure research and observation facility in Virginia. They were wrong. Later that night, the night the ship arrived, security officers discovered the bodies of 2 dock workers. They'd been savagely beaten and bore the signs of teeth marks, sharp teeth that had ripped and torn their flesh in the most hideous fashion imaginable. One man's left arm had been yanked right out of the socket, and his skull was... goddamn. His skull was all but pulverized. Blood and entrails littered the scene. You've got to understand that it's likely that this creature gave rise to both apes and men. And by this reckoning, and from what I've witnessed already, its intelligence is formidable, and in human terms, its physical strength is exponential. Jesus Christ, what can be done? As far as I know, there are at least 4 more confirmed deaths, all showing signs similar to those of the dock workers. The Department of the Interior is running things now, so officially, these will be all attributed to animal mutilations, black bear, wild dogs, whatever they can use to keep anyone from doing any deep digging, so to speak. I'm not sure what's next. Shit. I don't even know if I'm officially out of the loop. I almost hope that I am. Every time my phone rings, my heart races. And I haven't been sleeping. If the general public knew what I know, they wouldn't be sleeping either. Because it's still out there. It's that time again. Time for us to gather together and share a nightmare. And we have all the proper ingredients. A setting sun, a deep, dark swamp, and most importantly, a monster. A wicked stew indeed. Our tale is called The Thing in the Lake, a sinister recipe for a horrifying midnight snack on the Nightfall radio show. I've said it before, and I'll keep on saying it. Georgia is strange. And by strange, I'm not talking about those low-level, superficial trademarks that could be alluded to about any state in the country, each, of course, in their own way. Everybody's got ghosts, haunted locations. And UFOs, holy shit, they're zipping across the skies coast to coast with impunity. And my God, if you live anywhere between Atlanta and Anchorage, and there's more than 2 or 3 trees, a Bigfoot sighting is totally possible. But Georgia Strange is old, deep, mysterious. As old as the Paleo Indians, Georgia's first inhabitants. I remember my grandfather telling me about Suwannee Lake on the north side of the Okefenokee Swamp. It's an oxbow of the Suwannee Creek, which runs from the west into the swamp. But he told me about there being a strange creature in the lake. In fact, he called it a monster. He told me that it even killed people before. It would either swim up under the boat and turn it over, or it would just snatch someone right out of the boat. In either case, it would rip and tear its victims to pieces. He said it was something prehistoric, or maybe even something that came from space. He even caught sight of it once. That's what he told me. It was back in the 50s. He and a friend were out on the lake fishing, and just as dusk was coming on, they heard an enormous splash. They looked around, of course, and to their left, they saw something in the water, something moving towards them. And whatever it was big, at least the size of a big bull alligator. And then a huge serpent-like tail whipped out of the water, and this was followed by a reptilian-type head rising up. The thing's slanted yellow eyes flashed in anger, along with an aggressive hiss from its mouth, which was laced with large, sharp teeth. Both men looked at each other with that "let's get the fuck out of here" expression of confirmation and agreement. My grandfather started that Evinrude outboard motor, and they got the hell out of there. So that was in 1952. My grandfather would tell this story every once in a while. That's how I know it so well. But now, of course, he's long gone, and it's left to me. But I've come to understand that every time I share this story, that he's still with me, every day. It's time once again to gather together and share a rather strange experience. Mankind tends to view itself as king of the mountain and master of all it surveys. But what happens when we find out just how wrong we are? Our story is called The Spaceman, and he's just arrived from a star system on the far side of the Nightfall radio show. My grandfather and his brother, who everyone called Uncle Robert, were both avid hunters. In fact, it was them who taught me the ways of the woods and the hunt. But they told a story once about something very strange that happened to them on a hunting trip. They said it was in 1948. On that particular day, they'd gotten started late, taking time out for a big breakfast and to make a paper bag full of sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. There was really nothing out of the ordinary during that day, and they bagged 6 rabbits, which was great for them since hunting season for rabbits was coming to an end. The sun began to sink as they walked back to the truck, when they started hearing what they called an electronic sound. It's an interesting choice of words since this was a time long before any general knowledge of computers, and virtually no one owned a TV yet. But they described it like a high-pitched hum that came in low and got slowly louder, almost like an old-style radio that wouldn't tune into a station. And then in just the span of a few seconds, they saw something that seemed completely unbelievable. Uncle Robert said it was like a big goddamn top, the kind kids at the time played with. It was sinking down towards the ground in a clearing about 50 yards from us. And it looked like it was made out of polished metal, very silvery, except for some lights flashing around the edges. Now you would think that after seeing something like that, they'd have tried to get to their truck and get away as quickly as they could. But these guys were a different breed. These were men who had fought and beat the Nazis in Europe and North Africa. These were men that did not scare easily. As they watched, there was another strange electronic sound and something that vaguely resembled a door or hatch lowered. And as my grandfather put it, a spaceman came out. It was interesting to hear that mid-20th century jargon. But understand, in 1948, the word alien to infer extraterrestrial had not yet permeated the lexicon. Anyway, they described the visitor as roughly average size, perhaps a little smaller than they were. But he didn't have hair. They used the word he because, according to them, it just seemed male. And it had greenish skin and pointed ears. They said that he was carrying what looked to them to be a small object in his hand that also had blinking lights on it. Then the strange visitor looked directly at them, and all eyes locked. Uncle Robert said, he started walking in our direction, and me and your grandfather just looked at each other, and he said, we can't have this. And they raised their rifles. Uncle Robert said that the visitor stopped dead in his tracks, looked back down at that little box thing in his hand, and they could hear that weird electronic sound again. Then there was a bright flash of light. The object rose up in the air out of the clearing and moved off to the east until it was out of sight. You know, I often think about their story, how amazing it must have been to have such an encounter. And you know, this happened about a year after the Roswell incident. It's something to think about when you look up into the night sky and come to grips with the fact that we are not alone. You're cordially invited to join me in a shared nightmare experience. A nightmare in which we learn that, on occasion, dead doesn't necessarily mean dead. And as such, we shall call this tale, My Home is the Grave, which is, for the sake of convenience, right next door to the Nightfall radio show. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early on in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which meant that he didn't or wouldn't or couldn't talk, but there was no medical reason as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. But one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Dunch, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess, with fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said that they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, moving his mouth in a way that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to, quote, laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. And all these years later, I still don't know.